to Not in the State with me, National Core. In this episode, we want to discuss about how to decide which rental property to purchase. If you're seeking to buy a house for rental investment, how do you decide which one is good for that investment? And that I will talk about how to calculate the rental yield. I'm going to talk about how to calculate the payback period. And then maybe in the next episodes, we'll talk about deciding location for rental. All right. So basically, that's what we'll talk about: deciding which rental property to purchase if you're seeking a property for investment. Before I jump into that, let me just remind you about my book, Don't Buy That House. This is more or less a guide to off-plan house purchase. If you're seeking to buy a house off-plan, please get a copy of this book. I talk about the 7 areas of the 7 areas that you must tick, the 7 boxes that you must tick when buying a house for investments. Very interesting. I discuss in depth what the mistakes people have made and what you need to avoid. Now, let's talk about property investment. And in this one, I'm going to talk about buying houses for investment, buying houses for rental. With rental, be it an Airbnb, whatever it is that you're seeking to buy a house, be it you're buying it for commercial purposes, basically for investment. And I'm going to talk about the critical area of calculating rental yield. What are those things you need to look at when you're buying a house in terms of finances, the return? How do you work out that to decide this is the property to buy? Now, let me give you this rule, and this is my rule. This is not a real estate rule. This is my rule out of the many feasibilities I've done for the last 12 years, the many rental investments, working with developments, analyzing rent, analyzing real estate. This is the rule that I found that works. And you can try it because it works. Yes, I've tried it over the years. I've advised clients using it, and there's been no regret. This is the rule. Any rental property that you buy need to give you an annual rent that is 10% of its value. I'll repeat. Any rental property that you are buying needs to give you an annual rent that is 10% of its value. All right? So, if there's an apartment being sold in Kilimani for 10 million, I'll give you a real example. So, it's advertised for 10 million on the board. 10% of 10 million is 1 million. All right? So that rent, the rent from that apartment, needs to give you an annual rent equivalent to 1 million. That's a good investment. So let me repeat that because this is mathematics. I know I need to go slowly. A house in Kilimani is 10 million. So if you want to know that the investment there is right, 10% of 10 million is 1 million. The rental accumulation, the annual rent of that an apartment needs to accumulate to that 1 million, 10% of its value. That's a good investment. Right? That is a rule that I have used and it works. If you meet that, but usually if you meet that, I'm talking about payback period. If it's 10% the value of that apartment, the annual rent, usually you'll find the payback period will be less than 10 years. It will be less than 10 years. Now, that rule, you can use it also to decide whether the price being shown for you makes sense. I will explain. That 10% rule, that a rental property needs to give you an annual rent, 10% its value. And I will tell you, if it is being sold for 10 million, 10% of its value is 1 million, the rent for that apartment for 12 months needs to be 1 million. Then that is a good investment. Now, you can use that 10% rule if you are calculating whether the house price makes sense, because you'll work backwards. And I'll explain that shortly when I talk about rent. Now, the most critical thing that you will think of when you're buying a property for investment is rent. Forget about price for now. It is rent. Let me repeat. The critical thing for a buyer to interrogate when buying a property for investment, I repeat, for investment, is rent. Because when you buy to stay in, sometimes it's very emotive. You want to stay in current regardless of the price of the house. You will pay a ridiculous fee for it. So it's very emotive when you're buying to stay. But when you're buying for investment, the rent is the most critical. Why am I saying so? Because that rent price determines the rental yield and determines the payback period. All right? And I'm going to walk you through how developers twist these things, all right, to make it look nice and deceive you. Now, the centrality of rental investment is the rent price. So if there's anything you need to move mountains for to establish as a buyer, is the value of rent. What is the rental price? What is the rental value of that property? Forget about the price. Because if the rent is good, sometimes the price, then you'll get your good rental yield, or you'll get a good payback period. So we make the mistakes, most buyers make mistakes of focusing on the price and forgetting about the rent. And yet, this is something you're buying for investment. The rent price determines the rental yield and determines the payback period. So that is the sole important, not sole. That is the key. It is number one on that list of the things you must ensure is right. So if you're going to buy a property for investment, rent is the first question you must ask. What is the rent of this apartment being sold 10 million in Kiambu, in Tindigua? What is the rent of a 3-bedroom in Tindigua? That is what you need to establish, because what developers do, and they've known this, they will always put a higher rent value for that apartment in the advertisements. They say, oh no, this maisonette in Tiokimau is 10 million, but you can rent it at 60,000 per month, for instance. Now, forget about the 13 million that they're telling you. Can you rent it for 60,000? Because that is the most critical part for investment. So developers always, and I'll tell you, developers rarely will tell you the correct rental value for an apartment in that area. They will always overinflate it. Why do they always overinflate it? To make the rental yield look good. That's why they overinflate it. All right? So it is your duty to establish that the 60,000 you're being told for maisonette in Kumau, really is it 60,000? And I'm going to tell you an example, so many examples. I have done this exercise for so many buyers in this town, and even diaspora, so many people. I've done analysis for so many developments. All right? So many times. And all the time, the answer to that question is not always what I've arrived at when you do analysis of those rents. And I want to give you some examples. When you do analysis of those rents, I'll give you live examples. You'll realize that the analysis, the rental value they give you is less. It's more than what the market says. Now, I'll give you three projects that recently I analyzed. Yeah? I'll share them because these are public domains. As I said, the critical thing for rent, for investment, is the rental value. The critical thing if you're buying an apartment for investment is the rent. Pay attention to it. And throughout my analysis for over 5 years doing this analysis for rent, I have only once for a project in Ruiru did the developer quote the correct rent value in the advertisement. All the rest of the projects, it was higher than the market. It was higher than the market. Now, let me say this. A rental yield of between 8 to 10% is good. If you find a rental yield between 8 to 10% is good. Anything below 8, no. That is tight. A payback period of 9 to 10 years, it's okay. Anything above 10, forget. Of course, you can get lower, but sometimes also when you get lower payback periods, you begin to question yourself. Or when you get a rental yield of 15%, something is off. Right? Now, let me take you through these projects. I'm going to take you through Savo Stanley Kiambu. Then I'm going to take you through King's Boma Estate in Ruiru and Zima Home Wangige. Those three affordable housing developments, they have been put as affordable housing projects. Those three. Savo Stanley Kiambu, Zima Homes Wangige, and King's Boma. Now, and in this one, I want to look at the studio and the one bedrooms for each of those developments. All right? Let's go to Savo, and we'll calculate the yield together and the payback period. Savo, the studio apartments was being sold at 1.8 million. Savo Stanley, 1.8 million. All right? They had projected the rent at 13,500. That's what they put. The rent of that one studio in Stanley Kiambu, 13,500. All right? Now, if you take my rule of 10%, you get my point? That a property needs to give you an annual rent of 10% its value. The studio in Savo price is 1,800. 1.8 million, sorry. 10% of 1.8 million is 180. Meaning, that studio apartment, if it is good investments, must give you 180,000 in a year as annual rent. All right? Now, let's check whether it does that. Because they have given us a rent, thank God. Their rent is 13,500. All right? 13,500, and I'm going to do it here with you. 13,500 times 12 is 162,000. 162,000. So, even if you assumed that the rent price is correct, and in this case it was not correct, even if you assume the rent price is correct, the property is not giving you 10% of its value because it's 10% annual value is 180. It's giving you 162. It's falling short. It means it is telling you, what it's telling you is very simple, that if you take 13,500 as the rent, the annual rent as being 162,000, this studio should be 1.6 million and not 1.8. That's what it's telling you. And that one you have assumed that the rent they've given is fine. All right? If you assume that rent, then you'll find a yield of what? Of 1.8, of 9%. Now, how do you calculate rental yield? You take the annual value of the house divided by the price. So the annual rent value here is 162,000 divided by 1.8 times 100 is 9%. The yield is 9%. Now, as I told you, 8 to 10% is good. So you see why the yield is looking good, because the rent is higher. They've given you higher rent. You ask yourself, can you get 13,500 for a studio in Kiambu? Karum, Kiambu? The answer is no. Now, let's quickly look at their one bedroom. Their one bedroom, they're selling at 2.8 million, and they've given us a rent of 21,500. Again, the value is 2.8 million. If you use my rule of 10% annual rent, that a good investment should give you 10% of its value as annual rent, 10% of 2.8 million is 280,000. So let's see whether with a rent of 21,500, it meets the 280,000 annual. 21,500 times 12, 258. So same thing. Even if you assume that the rent is correct, it's not giving us 10% of the value of the unit, which is 280. It is 258. This is how you analyze whether you need to buy a studio, an apartment for investment. All right? If I take the rent they've given me, then I will tell Savo, based on the rent you're giving me, you need to give me this unit at 2.5. That's what the value needs to be. Because 258 is 10%. 100% is 2.5 million. Quickly realize that this project is about 200,000, 300,000 above the market price. All right? Rental yield. 258,000 divided by 2.8. You take the annual rent, divide by the value of the apartment. You'll get 9.4, 9.2%. Again, looking good. All right? Now, how do you calculate payback period? Is the opposite. If I'm getting an annual rent of 258, now for payback, to get how many years I'll take to break even, if annually I'm getting 258, how long will it take me to get 2.8? It's that simple. That's how you know the number of years. Each year, I'm giving 258. So how long will it take me to get 2.8? It is 10.9 years. As I told you, when it's above 10 years, tricky. Right? Let's look at King's Boma. I'm done with Savo. And you can see for Savo, there's a problem with their pricing. Even with the rent that seems high, it's not meeting the 10% rule I was talking to you about. Even if you assume the rent prices are correct, and trust me, no developer give you correct rent prices because they want their yield to look good, the rental yield. Even with that rule, the sale prices were still higher. It means those prices are priced well above the market. And the interesting thing about that Savo development was the house payment was spread between 12 months to 5 years. So you could pay that 2.8 million for 5 years. You can pay 2.8 to 5 years. A buyer will celebrate. A buyer will celebrate and say, oh, but I'm going to pay 2.5 million for 2.8 million for 5 years. So I'll pay slowly. That is good. But the thing is, that 2.8 value is giving you is a future value. It is the value that property will be actually in 5 years' time, probably. It's giving you a future value. So there's no benefit it's giving you. If you want to flip that market after buying it tomorrow, you will not flip. You probably sell it lesser than what you bought it at. That's the danger of having a higher prices of an apartment. King's Boma. Again, let's King's Boma Ruiru. This project is in Ruiru. I talk of King's Boma because if times allow, I'll look at Wangige, Zima. Now, let's look at King's Boma. Their studio is 1.25 million. Their studio, 1.25 million. With a rent of 10,000 per month. All right? Now, let's go to my rule. A property needs to give you 10% annual rent of its value. If it is 1.2 million, 10% annual rent will be 125,000. So, what is the rent they're giving you? 10,000. 10,000 times 12 is 120. That price is close to the market because the annual rent there is 125. The rent is giving you 120. The difference is 5,000 shillings. This is one of those projects that I've analyzed over the years that really was well priced and were very honest. Right? If you work out the rental yield, it was 9.6. Look at their one bed. They are selling their one bed at 1.5 million and a rent of 13,000. The price of the unit, 1.5. A good rental investment must give you 10% of its annual value. 10% of 1.5, 150. The rent there is 13,000. What is 13,000 annually? 13,000 times 12. 1.56. Times 12. So this one bed apartment that you buy at 1.5, if you rent it at 13,000, it will give you actually, if you use the rule of 10%, it gives you 156,000 per year, which is more or less the same as 10% of 1.5. Again, they got their pricing right. King's Boma. Selling one bed at 1.5. If you use that, the rule I told you, my rule of a property must give you 10% annual rent of its value. 10% of 1.5 is 150. All right? If you take 13,000 rent, they're giving you times 12, it's 156. It's more or less the same. Actually, it's slightly higher. And if you compare even the area with Savo, even the area of King's Boma is bigger than Savo. Studio area for Savo is 19 square meter. Studio area for King's Boma is 25. The one bed area for Savo is 28 square meter. One bed area for King's Boma is 30. And of course, the rental yield is now good. Better than Savo. For the one studio, 9.6%. For the one bed, it's 9.4. All right? So that is how you begin to analyze rent when you're buying property for investment. Wangige also was off. Let me look at studio only for Wangige. Zima Homes Wangige. The studio apartment is being sold at 1.7 million with a rent of 13,000. All right? Now let's check whether 1.7 makes sense. 10% of 1.7 is 170,000. Let's compare that against the rent of 13,000 per month. 13,000 times 12, 156. So Wangige also was falling short because what it tells us, it's the price of 1.7 needs to be 1.56. So what am I saying in short? When you're buying property for investment, when you reach a point where you want to buy a house for investment, you want to buy a house to rent, you want to buy a studio apartment to rent, whatever it is, rent. Confirm that the rent price is working. Once you get the rent price, work out the rental yield. All right? The rent price, forget about the price you're being told. Just forget about the price you're being told first. The rent price, you will use it to determine whether that price you're being told makes sense. All right? Because if I'm being told this apartment is 10 million, okay, let me go and get the rent for that apartment. The rent is 60,000. Or let's say the rent is 80,000. All right? Now, if the rent is 80,000, what is the annualized rent from 80,000? 9.2. So it means that apartment, 920, that apartment needs to be 9.2. So you use the rent to work backwards. It will also help you to negotiate. The rule of a property must earn you an annual rent 10% of its value. You will use it to know whether it makes sense, and you also use it to know whether the price is higher or lower. So you use it also to negotiate. So don't fall for this thing of going after price and forgetting about the rent, because that is what most buyers do when they're buying for investment. When they're buying for investment, the critical thing you must look at is rent. And from that rent, you'll calculate rental yield. Yes? And I've said to calculate rental yield is very simple. Take the rent value of that apartment, multiply by 12, divided by its value, times 100. So if the rent is 80,000 times 12, annualized rent, if you bought it at 10 million, divide that by 10 million times 100. That rental yield, if it's a good investment, needs to be between 8 and 10%. The payback period, take the rental yield, the annualized rent, all right? So you bought it at 10 million, yet you're earning annual rent of 800,000. How long will it take you to get to 10 million? How many years? Between 9 and 10 years? It's fantastic. That is how you work out those line items. So use that method to determine. People are buying apartments and they're taking 20 years to even break even. I mean, it's ridiculous. What were you thinking? What are you thinking? It doesn't make sense at all. Yeah? People are buying apartments with very high prices, and when you use this rule, you'll also realize how high some people are pricing their developments. And yet there are projects like King Bomber, as I said, that really are well within the market. Even their rents were quite within the market. Those projects are there. You just need to find the correct projects. So don't fall for it. All right? Make very wise investments for rentals. I've given you a tip on it. Work out the rent prices, rental yield, and payback period. Thank you very much.